Los Angeles awoke under a cool January sky. The streets still hushed before the daily rush. Retired Marine John Miller glanced at the modest garden he tended. A gentle pastime for a man used to life's storms. The morning's calm shattered when he noticed an eerie haze creeping along the horizon. Neighbors began stepping out of their houses, craning necks to see the source of the darkening sky. John's pulse quickened. Memories of battlefield dust merging with the ash drifting down. Deep inside, he knew his steady hands could still serve a purpose. Sirens wailed in the distance. The wildfire wasn't just an isolated spark, it would soon threaten the entire block. John tightened his worn boots, ready to confront the inferno at his doorstep. Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. John stood at the edge of his modest garden, the crisp morning air carrying a faint, acrid smell. The roses he'd painstakingly pruned just last week seemed dulled, their vibrant reds muted under a sky that had begun to lose its usual January brightness. He wiped his hands on his worn jeans, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. It had been 3 years since he'd returned to Los Angeles, but the city still felt foreign. The streets of his childhood had changed, corner diners replaced by chain coffee shops, old neighbors long gone. Even the air felt different, heavier, tinged with the unfamiliar. He'd come back to rebuild a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. After Diane's death, the house they had shared for decades felt too hollow, too quiet. His son had urged him to leave, to move closer to family in Texas. But John couldn't let go of the city that had shaped him. He stayed, clinging to the memories of what once was, hoping the rhythms of the neighborhood might soothe the ache in his chest. John had served 25 years in the Marines, a lifetime of structure and purpose. He'd seen deserts halfway across the world, coordinated disaster relief after hurricanes, and led missions into chaos that would paralyze most men. But nothing had prepared him for the silence that followed retirement or the relentless questions of what he was supposed to do next. The garden had become his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the simple act of tending to life. It wasn't much, just a patch of earth with flowers Diane used to love. Every morning, he knelt in the dirt, his hands calloused but steady, pruning and planting as if to convince himself that growth was still possible. He looked out at the street, squinting against the hazy sunlight. The block had changed since he'd last lived here full-time. Where Mr. Alvarez's deli once stood, a glossy smoothie bar now hummed with morning patrons. The corner gas station had been replaced by a high-rise with sleek, mirrored windows. Even the neighbors felt different, young families bustling with children, their faces unfamiliar and indifferent. John sighed and stepped back inside, where the faint scent of coffee lingered in the kitchen. He poured himself a cup, black and bitter, just the way Diane used to make it. His gaze drifted to the fridge, where a photo of them at Venice Beach was pinned by a magnet shaped like a seashell. He'd been tan and lean in the picture, Diane's laughter captured in midair as she held onto his arm. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The smell of smoke was stronger now, sharp enough to sting. At first, he thought it was coming from a neighbor's barbecue. But as he stepped out onto the porch, his chest tightened. The sky had darkened further, an unnatural gray spreading like spilled ink. Thin wisps of ash floated down, landing on the porch railing and the garden below. In the distance, faint sirens wailed, their urgency growing louder. Mrs. Castillo, his neighbor across the street, was outside, clutching a watering can. Her face was etched with worry as she called over to him. Her voice strained. "John. Do you smell that? What's happening?" He nodded. His stomach sinking. The signs were unmistakable. Years of military training had taught him to recognize trouble before it arrived at his doorstep. This was no distant blaze, the wildfire was closer than anyone wanted to admit. John scanned the horizon. His mind racing. He hadn't felt this kind of adrenaline since his deployment days. His hands clenched and unclenched as if testing their readiness. A muscle memory born from years of preparation. "Better be ready to leave," he called back. His voice steadier than he felt. The ash fell faster now. And the air grew hotter. The breeze carrying a faint roar he knew all too well. It was the sound of something relentless. Something that wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything in its path. John stared at the sky. His jaw tightening. He didn't know what he could do yet. But he knew one thing for certain, he wouldn't sit idly by. Not while his neighborhood, the only place that still felt like home, was under threat. He stepped back inside. Grabbed his boots. And laced them tightly. The photo of Diane on the fridge caught his eye again. Her laughter frozen in time. "Guess it's time to get to work," he murmured. Outside. The faint roar grew louder. The flames inching closer with every passing second. The first thing John noticed when he stepped outside again was the heat. It wasn't the comforting warmth of the California sun, this was oppressive. Dry. And biting. Like a hot breath smothering the air. The ash was falling thicker now. Dusting the sidewalk in pale gray flecks. Across the street. Mrs. Castillo was pacing by her car. Her arms filled with a jumble of items, a framed photo. A box of documents. And what looked like a ceramic angel from her front porch. She was muttering in Spanish. Her words quick and frantic. "Mrs. Castillo." John called as he jogged over. She turned to him. Her eyes wide with panic. "It's too much. John. I don't know what to take. Everything is important." John gently took the box from her trembling hands and placed it in the back seat of her car. "You're doing fine. Just grab the essentials, your papers. Medications. And anything irreplaceable." Her lips quivered. "But what if the house?" John nodded solemnly. He didn't sugarcoat it. "Get yourself safe. That's what matters now." He helped her load a few more items into the car, including a small bag of clothes and a blanket from her living room. By the time she drove off, the street was bustling with activity. Cars jammed the narrow lanes. Some honking in frustration. Others piled high with hastily packed belongings. People stood on porches, shouting instructions or calling out for family members. John saw a young boy clutching a dog. His mother frantically trying to buckle him into their car. A fire truck roared past, its siren piercing through the chaos, heading toward the plume of smoke rising just beyond the hills. For a brief moment, John stood frozen, torn between two instincts. Part of him wanted to grab what little he could and leave like everyone else. Diane's photo. His old Marine Corps medals. Maybe the box of letters his son had sent him during boot camp. It would be so easy to lock the door, get in his truck, and drive away. But the other part of him, the part forged through years of service, the part that refused to walk away from a fight, was louder. He could feel the pull, the gnawing sense that he was needed here. He thought of Mrs. Castillo's trembling hands, the panicked cries of the young mother, the firefighters heading straight into the inferno. No, he couldn't leave. Not yet. John made up his mind. He hurried back into his house, grabbed his boots and an old duffel bag, and drove toward the fire response center set up at a nearby school. When he arrived, the scene was organized chaos. Volunteers directed traffic while firefighters geared up in the parking lot. A table piled with donated water bottles and snacks stood near the entrance, where a woman with a clipboard was assigning tasks to the growing line of volunteers. John stepped forward, his movements purposeful. The woman glanced up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Name?" she asked briskly. "John Miller." She scanned him briefly, her eyes pausing on his sturdy frame and no-nonsense demeanor. "Ever done this kind of work before?" "Not exactly. But I served in the Marines. Disaster relief. Search and rescue, I've done my share." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good enough for me. Head to Station 2. They'll need extra hands." John made his way across the lot, weaving through clusters of volunteers and emergency workers. Station 2 was a makeshift team of firefighters preparing to deploy into the nearby neighborhoods. Among them was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, with a streak of soot on his cheek and an unmistakable air of impatience. "Another volunteer?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow as John approached. "That's right," John replied evenly, extending a hand. "John Miller." The young man hesitated before shaking it. "Ethan, firefighter with Station 18. Listen, no offense, but this isn't some neighborhood cleanup gig. You sure you're up for it?" John met Ethan's skeptical gaze without flinching. "I've faced worse than fire. Son, just tell me where you need me." For a moment, Ethan said nothing, his eyes narrowing as if weighing whether to argue. Finally, he sighed and pointed toward a stack of equipment. "Fine. Grab a respirator and gloves. We're heading out in 10. John nodded, his expression calm but resolute. He could feel the tension in the air, not just from Ethan but from others glancing at him with doubt. He didn't blame them. He knew he'd have to prove himself. As he pulled on the gear, the distant roar of the fire grew louder, a reminder of the battle ahead. He tightened the straps on his respirator, his mind already shifting into the familiar focus of preparation. "Let's move," Ethan called, his voice cutting through the noise. John joined the group, his steps steady as they headed toward the trucks. The chaos of the evacuation faded into the background, replaced by a singular purpose. He wasn't just a man standing on the sidelines anymore. He was part of the fight. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The truck rumbled to a stop, and Ethan hopped down, barking instructions at the small group of volunteers behind him. John followed, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. The air here was heavier, the acrid smell of smoke overpowering, and the faint crackle of flames in the distance set everyone on edge. "This is a high-risk zone," Ethan said sharply, adjusting the straps on his gear. "We've got a dozen homes on this block, and they all need to be cleared. Fast. Don't take chances. And if I tell you to pull back, you pull back. Got it?" John nodded along with the others, but Ethan's eyes lingered on him, skepticism radiating from his tense posture. "That goes double for you, sir," Ethan added, the last word edged with sarcasm. "Understood," John replied evenly, his voice steady. He wasn't here to win anyone's approval, he was here to help. The group fanned out, splitting into pairs to check the houses. John was assigned to Ethan, who didn't seem pleased about the arrangement. They approached the first house, a modest single-story with smoke seeping through the windows. Ethan pounded on the door. "Fire department. Is anyone inside?" No response. Ethan tested the door handle and found it unlocked. The two men stepped inside cautiously, the heat and haze pressing down on them. "Check the back," Ethan said curtly. motioning for John to move. John followed orders without complaint, moving through the small kitchen and into the bedrooms. His military training kicked in as he scanned for signs of life: an open window, a discarded shoe, anything that suggested someone had been here recently. He found no one. By the time he returned to the front, Ethan was already outside, shaking his head. "Empty," he said. They moved on to the next house, then the next. The tension between them simmered in the background, unspoken but palpable. Ethan's glances were sharp, like he was waiting for John to stumble, to give him a reason to say, "I told you so." At the fourth house, they encountered their first residents, an older couple, clearly panicked but reluctant to leave. "I'm not going anywhere," the man said stubbornly, his arms crossed over his chest. "We've lived here 40 years. We're not abandoning our home." Ethan's patience snapped. "Sir, if you stay here, you'll die. Is that what you want?" The man bristled. But before he could argue further, John stepped in. "Listen," John said gently, his tone firm but calm. "I get it. This house isn't just walls and a roof, it's your life. But right now, the best way to protect that life is to get somewhere safe. Let us help you do that." The man hesitated, his resolve wavering under John's steady gaze. Finally, he nodded. John helped them gather a few essentials while Ethan directed them to the evacuation route. When the couple was safely on their way, Ethan turned to John, his expression unreadable. "Not bad," he muttered, almost grudgingly. John just nodded, keeping his focus on the task at hand. As they approached the last house on the block, the situation took a dangerous turn. A gust of wind swept through the area, sending flames leaping across a dry patch of grass and cutting off their exit. "Damn it," Ethan cursed, scanning for a way out. The heat was intense, and the flames moved faster than seemed possible. For a moment, Ethan froze, his body stiff with indecision. John stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to move. There's a clear path to the left, stick close to the wall and stay low." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. They moved quickly, John leading the way and shielding Ethan when a fresh burst of embers rained down. When they finally reached safety, Ethan let out a shaky breath, his confidence visibly shaken. "Thanks," he said quietly. John didn't respond right away, his attention drawn to a woman standing on the porch of the house they'd just evacuated. She was clutching a toddler in one arm and gesturing frantically toward the flames. "My photos," she cried. "Please. They're in the living room, I couldn't carry everything." Ethan started to object, but John held up a hand. "I'll get them. Watch her and the kid." Without waiting for approval, John dashed back toward the house. Inside, the heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke. He kept low, scanning the cluttered living room until he spotted the box, a worn cardboard container labeled memories in neat handwriting. He grabbed it and hurried out, the flames licking at the walls as he made his escape. The woman's face crumpled with relief when he handed her the box. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her soot-streaked cheeks. Ethan watched the exchange silently, his expression softer than it had been all day. As they returned to the truck, Ethan finally spoke. "I was wrong about you." John glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "I figured you'd just get in the way," Ethan admitted. "But you've got a way of staying calm when everything's falling apart. People need that." John shrugged. "You learn a few things after 30 years of service." Ethan smirked, the tension between them easing for the first time. "Guess I could stand to learn a thing or two from you." The truck pulled away from the block, the flames still raging in the background. For the first time, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't in a long time: camaraderie. The fire might have been relentless, but so were they. Together, they'd face whatever came next. The fire's roar grew louder as John and Ethan arrived at the edge of a residential cul-de-sac. The heat was oppressive, pressing against them like an invisible wall. Smoke curled through the air, blurring the outlines of the houses ahead. "We need to clear this block," Ethan said, his voice tense. "Start with that house on the left." John nodded, following Ethan's lead as they approached a small, weathered bungalow. The curtains fluttered through a cracked window, and the faint hum of a television could be heard inside. Ethan banged on the door. "Fire department. Anyone inside?" The door creaked open a few inches, revealing an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane. His face was lined with age, his expression wary. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "Sir, there's a mandatory evacuation order in place," Ethan said. "You need to leave, now." The man shook his head. "This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's frustration was palpable. "If you stay here, you'll die. Do you understand that? Better to die here than be shoved into some shelter," the man muttered, turning away. Before Ethan could argue further, John stepped forward. He crouched slightly to meet the man's gaze, his tone calm and steady. "What's your name?" "Sir?" "Ed," the man replied after a pause. "Ed. I get it," John said. "This place means something to you. It's not just a house, it's your life. But right now, staying here doesn't protect that life. It puts it at risk. Let us help you get somewhere safe." Ed hesitated, his grip tightening on the cane. "I don't have much left. You know, just some photos and memories. We'll make sure you have those," John said firmly. "But we need to move now. Please. Trust me." After a long moment, Ed nodded. "All right. Let me grab a few things." John helped him gather a small bag while Ethan waited outside, glancing nervously at the horizon where flames licked closer. When they finally got Ed into the evacuation truck, Ethan turned to John, his expression conflicted. "You've got a way with people," he admitted. John gave a faint smile. "Sometimes, they just need to feel heard." The two returned to the cul-de-sac, but the situation had worsened. The wind shifted abruptly, sending embers swirling through the air. A sudden surge of flames leaped toward them, cutting off their route. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, his eyes darting frantically. John took stock of the situation. The fire was moving fast, devouring everything in its path. Their usual exit was gone, and the heat was growing unbearable. "Ethan, we need to move," John said, keeping his voice level. Ethan didn't respond. He stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Ethan," John barked, stepping closer. "Stay with me. Focus." Ethan's eyes flicked to John, his expression panicked. I can't. It's too fast. We're trapped." "You've done this before," John said, his tone firm but encouraging. "You know what to do. Take a breath. We'll get through this." Ethan exhaled shakily, nodding. John scanned the area, his military instincts kicking in. To their right, he spotted a narrow alleyway partially shielded by a retaining wall. It wasn't ideal, but it might be enough. "There," John said, pointing. "We'll take that alley. Stay low and keep moving." Ethan followed as John led the way, crouching to avoid the worst of the smoke. The flames seemed to reach for them, the heat searing their skin. Halfway through the alley, a section of the wall collapsed, scattering debris in their path. John grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him back just in time. "Stay close," John said, his voice cutting through the chaos. They finally emerged into a clearing, coughing and sweating but alive. Behind them, the fire raged on, consuming the houses they had just left. Ethan sank to the ground, his head in his hands. "That was too close," he muttered. John sat beside him, giving him a moment to collect himself. "You okay?" Ethan shook his head. "I froze back there. I've never done that before." "It happens," John said gently. "Even to the best of us." Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with a vulnerability John hadn't seen before. "There was this fire last year. We lost 2 guys. I keep seeing it every time we get close like that. It's like I can't shut it off." John nodded, his expression understanding. "Sounds like you're carrying a lot." "I've been there." Ethan frowned. "How do you deal with it? The fear? The guilt?" "You don't get rid of it," John said after a pause. "You learn to live with it. You focus on what you can control, being prepared, staying calm, and you lean on the people around you. You're not in this alone." Ethan nodded slowly, his breathing evening out. "Thanks," he said quietly. John clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on. We've got more work to do." As they made their way back to the truck, Ethan seemed steadier, his confidence tentatively returning. The fire was still burning, but John knew they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. The radio crackled to life in the truck as John and Ethan caught their breath from their last mission. The dispatcher's voice was tight. "Urgent. We've got a report of a missing child in a residential area. 800 block of Maple. Last seen inside the house before the fire advanced. Units in the vicinity. Respond immediately." John glanced at Ethan, whose jaw tightened as he gripped the steering wheel. The young firefighter hesitated, his eyes locked on the horizon where Maple Street lay obscured by thick plumes of smoke. "I've got it," Ethan finally muttered, his voice low. The truck rumbled toward the address, but the closer they got, the more the tension in the cab grew. Ethan's hands were rigid on the wheel, his knuckles white against the grime of the day. John watched him carefully, noticing the faint tremor in his breathing. They arrived to find the fire swallowing the house at the center of the block. Flames licked at the edges of the roof, and smoke poured from the windows. Neighbors stood nearby, some shouting while others clutched each other in panicked silence. A woman ran toward them, her face streaked with soot and tears. "My son. He's inside," she cried, clutching John's arm. "How old is he?" John asked, steady but urgent. 6, she sobbed. "His name is Ben. He was in his room. I tried, but I couldn't get to him." Ethan froze, his face pale. John turned to him, noticing the way his breathing quickened, his gaze fixed on the house like it was a monster ready to devour him. "Ethan," John said sharply, stepping into his line of sight. "Look at me." Ethan blinked, his focus shifting to John. "We can do this," John said firmly. "You've done it before, and you're not doing it alone. We go in together. We come out together. You with me?" Ethan swallowed hard and nodded, though his hands still shook as he reached for his gear. The 2 men approached the house, their respirators in place and their movements synchronized. The heat was immediate, pressing down on them as they entered through the front door. Smoke reduced visibility to almost nothing, forcing them to crouch low. "Ben!" John called out, his voice muffled but strong. "Can you hear me?" A faint cough answered from somewhere down the hall. Ethan tensed. And for a moment, John thought he might freeze again. But then Ethan pushed forward, his voice steadier now. "Ben, keep talking," he called. They followed the sound, weaving through the hallway as the walls creaked ominously. John's military instincts kicked in, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. They reached a small bedroom, the door partially ajar. Inside, Ben was huddled under a blanket, his tiny frame trembling as the flames grew closer. John moved quickly, scooping the boy into his arms. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft despite the chaos around them. Ethan took the lead as they turned back toward the door. But the flames had advanced, blocking their original path. "This way!" John shouted, spotting a window at the far end of the room. Ethan nodded, helping clear debris as John shielded Ben with his body. The glass shattered easily, letting in a rush of fresh air that felt like a lifeline. Ethan climbed out first, reaching back to help as John passed the boy to him. Then John hoisted himself through, landing hard on the ground outside. They moved quickly away from the house, the flames roaring behind them as the roof collapsed in a cascade of sparks. The mother ran to them, her sobs breaking as she gathered Ben into her arms. "Thank you," she whispered over and over, clutching him like she'd never let go. Ethan stood silently, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths as he watched the reunion. John placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You did good in there," John said. Ethan turned, his expression raw. "I froze. Though. At first. I froze. But you didn't stay frozen," John replied. "That's what matters." Ethan let out a shaky laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't get how you stay so calm." Even with all this, he gestured to the burning house behind them. "It's not about staying calm," John said. "It's about finding the calm in the chaos. You focus on what you can control, and you trust the rest to the team around you." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, I thought you were just another well-meaning volunteer when you showed up. But I was wrong. You're more than that." John gave him a small, knowing smile. "You're learning fast, kid." Ethan smiled back, a genuine warmth in his expression now. The doubt and tension that had defined their partnership earlier in the day seemed to dissipate, replaced by mutual respect. As they walked back to the truck, the radio crackled with new calls. The fire wasn't done with them yet, but neither was their fight. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, his movements steadier now. John settled beside him, glancing once more at the woman and her son, now safely huddled together on the curb. It was moments like this, he thought, that made all the difference. "Ready for the next one?" Ethan asked, his tone lighter. John nodded. "Let's go." They drove off toward the next mission. Two men bound by fire, courage, and the understanding that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the heat of the battle. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, faint but persistent, as John walked down the street that had been his home for decades. Charred remnants of houses lined the block, their skeletons stark against the pale morning sky. His boots crunched softly on the soot-dusted pavement, a sound that felt louder in the unnatural quiet of the aftermath. He stopped at the remains of Mrs. Castillo's house. The vibrant flowers she had once tended were now blackened stems poking through scorched soil. She was across the street, sitting on the curb with a salvaged photo album in her lap. Her eyes glassy as she stared into the distance. "You need a hand, Mrs. Castillo?" John asked gently, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up, her expression softening when she saw him. "I don't know what to do," she murmured. John crouched beside her. "Let's start small. One step at a time. Together." They sifted through the debris, salvaging what little could be saved: a metal trinket box, a few singed papers, and a ceramic angel miraculously intact. John carried the items back to her makeshift pile of belongings, offering quiet reassurances that the community would rebuild. Everywhere he went, similar scenes unfolded. Neighbors wandered through what remained of their homes, some crying, others numb. John worked alongside them, lifting, sorting, and listening. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. As the day wore on, John returned to his own house, or what was left of it. The garden had suffered the worst, the roses reduced to brittle stems and ash. He paused at the edge of the yard, his hand resting on the gate, before stepping inside. The house itself had been spared, though the paint was blistered, and the air inside carried the faint tang of smoke. John moved slowly through the rooms, his eyes lingering on familiar objects: Diane's photo on the fridge, the worn recliner where he used to read, the shelf of books she'd insisted on keeping despite his protests about clutter. Out back, he stood in what had been his sanctuary, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the damage. The sight hurt, but it didn't crush him. The fire had taken much, but not everything. He knelt beside a patch of blackened soil, running his fingers through the dirt. Beneath the surface, he knew the roots were still alive, waiting for a chance to grow again. "This is what it's about, Diane," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Showing up, even when it's hard, even when it feels like there's nothing left." The creak of a gate drew his attention. He turned to see Ethan standing there, his gear traded for a simple t-shirt and jeans. "Thought I'd find you here," Ethan said, stepping into the yard. John rose, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Didn't think you'd stop by." Ethan shrugged, his usual bravado tempered by something quieter, more genuine. "Figured I owed you a proper thank you. For everything." "You don't owe me anything," John replied. "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I do. Back there, in the thick of it, I was ready to fold. But you didn't let me. You kept me steady. That's not something I'll forget." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. "You're good at this," Ethan said finally, gesturing to the yard, the house, the neighborhood, helping people, leading. "You ever think about sticking around? Maybe training some of us young guys how to do it better?" John chuckled, the sound low and warm. "I think you're doing just fine, kid." Ethan grinned, but his expression turned serious again as he extended a hand. "Well, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." "Thanks, sir." John froze for a moment, then shook Ethan's hand firmly. The word "sir" carried weight, a mark of respect earned rather than demanded. After Ethan left, John lingered in the garden, his gaze sweeping over the damage once more. It wasn't just the plants that needed rebuilding, it was the people, the homes, the connections that made this place more than just a neighborhood. He picked up a charred piece of wood and set it aside, clearing space for new growth. The fire had taken much, but not everything. Beneath the ash lay seeds of resilience, waiting to take root. Courage wasn't about the size of the battle, it was about showing up, day after day, for the things that mattered. John had spent a lifetime in service, and though the uniform was gone, the oath he'd taken remained. Serving wasn't confined to the battlefield, it lived in the small, quiet acts of rebuilding, of helping others find their footing, of standing firm in the face of the flames. And so, John began again. Not because he had to, but because it was who he was. The neighborhood would heal, just as he would. One step at a time, one seed at a time, and one day, the garden would bloom again.
The garden will bloom again, just as John and his community will heal. Courage isn't about size, it's about heart. How would you define courage in your own life? Share your thoughts and this story with others. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.